This, to me, defines the comradeship we developed, and may I give you one example. Medicines were practically non-existent, as we were never given any medical supplies whatsoever by the Japanese. The Red Cross medical supplies sent to Japan for use by the POWs were taken by the Japanese military, repackaged and sent to their combat troops. After the war, the Allied forces found warehouses all over Japan filled with Red Cross medical, clothing, and food supplies which had been sent for use by the POWs, which had been stored to be used by the Japanese troops in the event of an invasion of their homeland. Our only hope was to pool whatever meager supplies we had in the camp and use them for the maximum benefit of all. This had to be done in complete secrecy, as the Japanese confiscated any medical supplies they found, and treatment of POWs by our own doctor was absolutely forbidden. This presented a very great problem, as everyone hoarded whatever medicines they had. While you may not have the right medicine or drug for wherever illness you encountered, at least you had a chance to barter or trade for the one you did need. On our starvation diet, we had no resistance whatsoever to any disease or infection. We suffered at all times from the ravages of malnutrition and its medical consequences: beriberi, pellagra, blindness, gangrene, etc. Once our doctor got going on secret sick parades, the men soon believed in us and started to turn in their bits and pieces of medical supplies to the doctor. A detailed account was kept of all our camp medical supplies, as to where they came from, who gave them, how much we had, how much was used, and on who. These accounts were available and could be seen at any time by anyone in the camp. One POW from Hong Kong had smuggled in 3 morphine pills, which he turned into the doctor. As these were the only painkillers we had, it was agreed that a unanimous vote of the entire camp would be necessary before one could be used. Now, the reason for this was that you never knew when it might be your turn to need such help to get over that last big painful hump, and hence you'd better have a say as to how and when they were used. Once they were gone, there just wasn't any more. Time and again, the doctor would decide to use a pill in such cases as drastic surgery due to gangrene, as all this had to be done without any anesthetic. He also recommended that they be used in the case of the 3 men we lost just before they died, when there was nothing more we could do for them. In every instance, the unanimous decision was obtained from the camp, only to have it vetoed by the man who was to receive the pill. Now, I was separated from that camp after 2 years, but I understand that those same 3 pills were still unused at the end of the war. A word about our stealing, because this was one of the main ways to our survival. Our camp worked at many various jobs each day, and it was possible on a lot of the jobs to steal things which were not only of great benefit to the camp, but also to the Japanese with whom we worked. A good example was an oil factory where they crushed peanuts, coconuts, soybeans, etc., to make various cooking oils and lubricant oils from castor beans. This was a gold mine for us, as we stole peanuts and coconut for food, and we set up making soap in the boiler plant of the factory by making trays out of old tins, stealing coconut oil and caustic, which we then cooked on top of the boilers. Now, the coolies we worked with knew what we were doing, so we marked trays with their name on it. When their tray of soap was done, we would cut the slab of soap in half and give them half. We would then smuggle our half out of the job and back to camp. We were searched inside the factory by the factory guards before we left the job, and then again outside the camp by the Army guards before we got on the trucks or were marched back to the camp. And then at the camp, we were searched once again inside the camp by the camp guards. If at any time in this entire process we were caught, we never implicated the Japanese workers, and they knew this, so they trusted us even more than they did their own fellow workers. Other items of great value to the Japanese because of the strict rationing, in addition to the soap, was sugar, salt, cooking oil. These items we stole not only from the factories, but also when we were unloading or loading railway cars, ships, and barges. We were able, by stealing on one job and trading with the Japanese coolies with whom we worked on other jobs, to get a meager supply of drugs available on the Japanese market to supplement our meager supplies. As for the men who did the stealing, we set up a system whereby anything of value to the camp, such as food, trade goods, etc., the man doing the stealing would notify the officers, and an officer would go out to work on the job with him. If the man got caught, then the officer would step in and say he had ordered the prisoner to steal. In this way, the officer took the giant share of the bashing, solitary confinement, and other punishment. If the stealing was successful, then half the goods was turned into the camp supplies and used for the sick or to trade with the coolies for medicines. Here again, complete records were kept, and anyone could see them at any time to ensure just how their goods were being used. A few words on the pride and self-respect of the men, no matter what their original background or the results of the degradation and environment in which we existed. I was far from being an ideal prisoner, and when one of the Japanese guards consistently beat up the very sick prisoners, I went after him and beat him into the deck. I shall not go into the aftermath of that affair. Suffice to say, I was extremely lucky to barely survive the punishment and not be killed. When the beating of the sick started up again, the men said I should try something else, as I would never live through that punishment again. So we held a sit-down strike, and after I received a terrible beating, but also the assurance that the sick would not have to go to work, did I give the order for the men to go. My hour of glory was very short-lived, and I was removed from that camp within an hour and sent to an extreme discipline camp at Omori, Tokyo, to show me the error of my ways. There I was set up as a very bad example, and it was the kiss of death for any other prisoner to even look at me in front of the specially selected sadistic guards. For the first 2 weeks, I worked all day sewing bits of fur together, and then all night in the cookhouse. Here, the punishment was to stand on the hot brick ovens in bare feet and holding 2 large buckets of water. Now, with our painful bare feet, this was sheer and utter hell. I slept in little short naps whenever I could, out of the sight of the guards. About this time, the POW camp of Canadians in Yokohama, which had no doctor and whose senior POW was an RSM, ran into a bad session of sickness. A group of the sick were moved to another camp, but en route they stopped off at the discipline camp for a few days. The day they arrived, they heard that I was in camp and that the Canadian sergeant in charge of them came to see me in the shop where the officers were sewing the bits of fur together. He threw the first salute between POWs that had been seen in that camp and explained that the Canadians had heard about my efforts on behalf of the POWs, and as I was the first Canadian officer that they had met since leaving Hong Kong, they would like to hold a parade for my inspection. I tried to explain what this would mean, but to no avail. Reluctantly, I agreed, and he said they would be formed up in a few minutes. They formed up in the open dirt area which we used for roll calls, parades, and forming of work parties. They were dirty, sick, ragged, starved. Some had to be held up by their comrades, but they were all there. As I expected, no sooner had we got started than the storm broke in all its fury, and the guards came charging into us like a bunch of raving maniacs, swinging fists, clubs, rifle butts, and kicking the daylights out of any of us who fell down. None of us minded, and when it was all over, we'd crawl back into our huts to lick our wounds and to have a damn good laugh at the Japanese. I guess one interpretation would be that it was an act of defiance, and that may be right. But bear in mind that these men were from the reserve units out of Montreal and Winnipeg, and in the majority of cases, their military background was practically nil. All had been reduced to the lowest state of civilization possible by their maltreatment and horrible environment, and yet there was a pride in these men such as I've never seen before or expect to see again. It made me proud to be admitted into their ranks. I might add that news of this parade spread like wildfire throughout the working camps in Japan, and the rise in morale amongst the POWs made life hell for the Japanese guards. And the Omori discipline camp was on a small island out in the Tokyo harbor. It was made from silt and sand dredged up from the Tokyo harbor and was about 50 feet from the mainland. There was an anti-aircraft battery on one end and a searchlight battery on the other, with our camp sandwiched in between. We were housed in the standard prefabbed single-story wood buildings used by the Japanese military, and we were right opposite the main fighter base at Haneda Airport, which protected the Tokyo-Yokohama area. With no markings whatsoever to show that we were POWs, we were extremely vulnerable. And so whenever a single B-29 came over, obviously on a photo recce, we would run out into the open parade square, and unbeknownst to the Japanese, we would form the letters POW in hopes that this would show up on their photos. The fire bombings and firestorms wiped out the entire area around our camp, and the only thing that saved us was that 50 feet of water separating us from the mainland. The whole area all around us was as flat as a pancake, exactly like our Northland after a big forest fire. With no food, water, electricity, or places to work, the Japs started to move some of us out into the outlying areas. And as I was one of the bad actors, I was one of the first to go. They took a bunch of us from the various camps in the Tokyo area and put us into railway boxcars where we were so jammed that we had to take turns standing and sitting. It was cold, no food, water, or sanitation facilities, and we were there for well over 48 hours. Many of us had amoebic dysentery or diarrhea, and life soon became grim, to say the least. We were taken up into the mountains northwest of Tokyo, and here we ended up on a siding where we were able to get out and lie down on the ground. And this was the first opportunity I had to see what prisoners were there, their physical condition, and then the sad realization that once again I was the senior POW. There was a total of 280 POWs, a real mixed bag, and the physical condition was the worst I had ever seen. Some were blind from lack of vitamin A, some had lost a foot hand from beriberi followed by gangrene. All were skin and bones from prolonged malnutrition. As we were the first batch out of the Tokyo camps, the commandants once again had unloaded all their sick invalids and misfits. We were now jammed onto flatbed trucks and taken off to our camp way up in the mountains at a place named Suwa. It was high in the mountains and it was cold, especially at night, when we might even have a thin coating of ice on any open water. The camp was only half built. Some of the buildings had no roof, some had no sidewalls. There was no kitchen, cooking, or sanitation facilities. The wiring consisted of a single line running through the camp with 1 or 2 40-watt bulbs in each building. It was pouring rain. Everyone was soaked, cold, miserable, starving, and filthy beyond belief. The barracks were of little protection as there was no straw on the bare boards for us to lie on, and the floors were just pure mud. The next day we tried to fix up the camp. We found that we were on the side of a mountain which was all terraced with rice and vegetable paddies. Our main water supply was a small creek which ran down through the paddies and then through the camp. Since the fertilizer they used was human excreta, we had to set up a system to at least boil all our drinking water. We tried to make our barracks as airtight as possible with mud, straw, and grass, as we had no heat whatsoever, and we set up the most basic washing and latrine facilities. The work details started at once. The prisoners left the camp at 7 a.m. each morning, walked down the side of our mountain and up the side of the next one to get to an open-faced mine where they dug out the ore, which was some kind of white metal. The path between the camp and the mine was all rough, broken stone, and with no shoes, only wooden clogs, the number of seriously infected feet went completely out of control. Our food ration was the lowest I had encountered, and with no medicines or medical treatment, this was indeed a death camp. It was our conservative but very well considered estimate that we would be extremely lucky if just one of us was going to survive that coming winter of 1945. As the war started to go against the Japanese and the Allies began their island-hopping advance toward Japan, the orders had gone out from Tokyo headquarters to all the military that they were never to retreat, but rather fight to the last man, even with suicidal attacks. Kamikaze aircraft were a very good example of this philosophy. Also, the orders were that at the first sign of a landing and attack on their area, they were to kill all the POWs, internees, sick, wounded, incompetents, etc., so that every able-bodied Japanese could fight to the death without hindrance. In the POW camps, we had to dig trenches, and machine guns were placed at each end. We were then to be marched into the trenches, doused with gasoline, and set on fire. Anyone trying to escape would be killed by the machine guns. Proof of this policy was more than evident in the Japanese-occupied islands, which were overrun by the Americans, who then found all the POWs, sick and wounded, both captives and Japanese, all massacred by the Japanese as they retreated. The Japanese surrender, we took over our camp to ensure our survival and concentrated on getting ourselves physically fit enough to get out of there and get into the hands of the Allies. We took over all the food we could find and ran the kitchen on a 24-hour basis. We bought a pig, a horse, and a cow, which we slaughtered and put into the stew pot. Believe me, everything went in with the possible exception of the skin and hooves. We scoured the countryside for all the medical supplies we could beg, borrow, buy, or just expropriate, so that our doctor and his helpers could work day and night to bring the seriously ill back to as good health as possible. We got yellow paint and painted big POW signs on the roofs of our buildings. We made flags out of old bed sheets and colored them with crayons. We put these up on flagpoles, and then we waited. The U.S. Navy planes soon found us, and we were showered with bundles from heaven containing clothing, food, medicines, and goodies such as cigarettes and chocolate bars. When the doctor felt we were as fit as he could get us, we made our move and came out overnight by train to Tokyo. When we couldn't find any Allied forces near the Tokyo railway station, we moved over to the station for the electric train and went on to Yokohama. Here we went outside the station, sat down, flew our flags on some bamboo poles we had liberated. Now, it was not all that easy. You must remember we had some prisoners who were blind, some minus a foot or hand, some unable to walk on painful feet from beriberi, and all of us at the end of our endurance. Thus we had to commandeer trucks, wagons, bicycle trailers, anything that we could lay our hands on to carry our sick and invalids. The healthiest POWs carried the Japanese guards' rifles just in case we met up with trouble, as once we left the relatively safe confines of our camp, we were on our own, and God help us. We didn't have long to wait outside the Yokohama station before a Jeep came by with a U.S. Army officer and a big radio on it. We identified ourselves. Chap got on his radio, and we were soon inundated with buses, trucks, and ambulances, which took us down to a reception center set up in the Yokohama docks. We were then told to get out and go into the dock area. Next thing I knew, our senior POW NCO called the troops to attention, formed them up into marching order, turned the parade over to me, and we marched into the dock area with our homemade flags flying. We were dirty, tired clothing. But we were defiant, proud. The first thing was to strip us all of our clothes and to throw them into an incinerator. Next, they removed all our body hair and put us through a delousing station. From there into a hot shower with lots of hot water and soap. While stark naked, we were confronted by a horde of doctors and nurses who segregated us into groups depending on our medical condition, then into a room with all the clothes in the world where we could take as much of everything as we wanted. Finally, we were given a thorough interrogation by a team of intelligence and war crimes officers. All the time this was going on, there were Red Cross girls going around dishing out cigarettes and chocolate bars. I was taken to the hospital ship USS Marigold as I was out on my feet and don't even remember going on board. I do recall that I was taken to a cabin where I had all to myself. This was the first time since being captured that I was all on my own, except when I had been in solitary. I had pajamas, clean ones too, the first time in 3.5 years. I was really clean and clear of lice, fleas, bed bugs, the first time in 3.5 years, and finally had absolutely no responsibility for anyone other than myself, the first time in 3.5 years. Now, our camp was unique in having 100% survival from the instant that the war ended until we were recovered by the Americans. Now, this is only due to the full-out cooperation and self-discipline of all the men in that camp. By way of explanation, the Americans were very cautious and stayed in the Yokohama dock area until they were certain that the Japanese military and civilians would accept the surrender and not kill the POWs and internees as they had been ordered to do. A large part of the Japanese military would not accept the surrender and vowed to fight to the finish, while there was also a tremendous number of civilians who had lost members of their family, especially in the firebombing, who were still very hostile. For those POWs who were inland, such as ourselves, you either had to wait a long period of time to be recovered or try to beat your way out. I'm afraid that in the majority of camps it was every man for himself, and in a lot of cases that was fatal. The civilians retaliated, as did the military. Some POWs ate poisonous food and drank wood alcohol and died. Others started out on journeys far beyond their physical capability and died en route to freedom. You must remember that it was most difficult, if not impossible, to control men who had been through 4 years of sheer and utter hell, especially when there was absolutely no way of enforcing any discipline. During the war, over 30% of all the POWs and internees taken by the Japanese were either killed or died in the POW camps. And thus, they never did make it home. Here, I think that the epitaph on the memorial in the Allied War Graves Cemetery in Kohima, Burma, where over 1,500 Allied servicemen are buried, sums it up very well. Quote, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today," unquote. Catchphrases are wonderful things, and by way of trying to summarize this whole thing, if I had to use one to define my concept of leadership, it would be the 3 C's. First, character. It is my firm belief that the true and solid foundation is integrity. Or as Shakespeare had Polonius say in Hamlet, "This above all else to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night to day, that thou canst not then be false to any man." Say what you mean, which is the telling of the truth as against the telling of lies, and then mean what you say, which is integrity. Having the moral fiber to face the issues of right and wrong, and then the courage to stand up firm and strong, regardless of the consequences to yourself. Second, competence. Having the necessary knowledge, education, training, and judgment, and to make full use of them, no matter how large or small the problem, to ensure that you have given it your fullest consideration. Once you have done this and made your decision, then to carry it out to the very best of your ability, know what you're doing and how to do it. Third, comradeship. Take a full interest in your subordinates, having true respect and concern for them, to the extent that at all times and in all circumstances you put their welfare and well-being ahead of your own, regardless of the cost or inconvenience to yourself. Once these are firmly in place, then the other important aspects, such as discipline and self-discipline, pride in yourself and in your unit, self-respect and respect for both your superiors and subordinates, proper dress and deportment at all times, all these will develop and strengthen as they feed on one another until what I call true leadership emerges. Now live by these precepts, and as a member of the Canadian Forces devoted to the well-being of your fellow Canadians and the preservation of our Canadian way of life, you will not only attain true self-respect, but also the respect of everyone with whom you associate. You can never have a better goal in life. Canada needs our Canadian Forces, they who will be the leaders, the protectors and defenders of our country in the years 2000 AD. It needs their youth, courage and energy, but there's also a desperate need for their self-discipline, their discipline of the mind, their character, their integrity, in short, their leadership. As I examine and work with the Canadian Forces, I have absolutely no qualms about the future of our services. Admiral Bull Halsey, a famous World War II admiral of the U.S. fleet in the Pacific, once said, "There are no great men. There are only great challenges ordinary men are forced by circumstances to meet." As the history of our services prove, there has never been, nor will there ever be, any shortage of ordinary men and women in our forces who are ready, willing, and most capable to take up the challenges they will be forced to face. If I may borrow the RCAF motto, per ardua ad astra, through adversity to the stars. This is the heritage which you have been entrusted into the hands of our Canadian forces. May they guard it well, as I have every confidence they will. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an honor and a privilege to have shared these thoughts with you. Bonne chance et merci bien.
The citation for the Order of the British Empire for gallantry reads, in part, as senior Allied officer in the camps in which he was located, he continually displayed the utmost concern for the welfare of his fellow prisoners. On many occasions, with complete disregard for his own safety, he prevented as far as possible Japanese officials from sadistically beating his men and denying prisoners the medical attention which they so urgently needed. Typical of his splendid gallantry was when, in the Yokohama camp, he called a sit-down strike in protest against ill treatment of his men. On another occasion, when the Japanese wanted to send some sick prisoners of war to work, Squadron Leader Birchall found it necessary, at great personal risk, to prevent forcibly the Japanese non-commissioned officer in charge from making these prisoners work. As a result, Squadron Leader Birchall spent several days in solitary confinement. Nevertheless, the sick prisoners of war did not have to work. Knowing that each time he forcibly intervened on behalf of his men, he would receive brutal treatment, Squadron Leader Birchall endeavored to improve the lot of his fellow prisoners. He also maintained detailed records of personnel. The consistent gallantry and glowing devotion to his fellow prisoners of war that this officer displayed throughout his lengthy period of imprisonment are in keeping with the finest traditions of the Royal Canadian Air Force.